Good evening. This is Tuesday, November 11th, 69 days until the inauguration of President-elect Barack Obama, and there is breaking news at this hour. Absentee ballots counted today in Alaska, and they are not all counted, not by a long shot. The ones that have been counted have put Democrat Mark Begich in front of Republican Senator Ted Stevens by exactly 3 votes. 1, 2, 3 votes. That leads our fifth story in the countdown tonight, along with the Senate races in Minnesota and Georgia. In the latter, Senator John McCain, who had denounced Saxby-Chambliss as reprehensible for his infamous 2002 ad showing the faces of his opponent Max Cleland and Osama bin Laden. That was then. This is tomorrow. In advance of the Georgia runoff, McCain will campaign tomorrow for Saxby-Chambliss, because the word reprehensible may start with the letters R-E-P, but so does Republican. Republicans raising doubts about the validity of the recount in Minnesota even before it begins. Norm Coleman's campaign boasting that 120 of its lawyers may soon descend on the 100 recount sites, which will begin the official double check on November 19. And the National Republican Senatorial Committee has distributed a 3-page memo called a backgrounder, painting the Minnesota Secretary of State Mark Ritchie, a Democrat, as grossly biased, with links to the voter registration organization Acorn, the GOP bogeyman of choice circa last month. Coleman's lead has already shrunk to just over 200 votes out of 3 million cast. Coleman's lawyer calls that mysterious and statistically dubious. Nice to meet you, Mr. Dubious. Franken's campaign says that Coleman knows better and is assembling its own lawyers and volunteers for the recount sites. And the Minnesota Secretary of State Ritchie today addressed the Coleman campaign criticism, saying, quote, their goal is to win at any price. Ritchie's office announced the recount canvassing board, which includes 2 state Supreme Court justices appointed by the Republican governor, Tim Pawlenty, along with 2 other judges and Mr. Ritchie himself. Now to Georgia. The runoff between Senator Chambliss and his Democratic rival will bring Senator McCain back to that state tomorrow. And Democrats have posted a web-only ad reminding voters about Senator McCain's opinion of the Chambliss 2002 campaign, quoting, I'd never seen anything like that, McCain said in July 2003, putting pictures of Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden next to the picture of a man who left 3 limbs on the battlefield. It's worse than disgraceful. It's reprehensible. In the current runoff, Senator Chambliss has already aired an ad beginning with images of the 9/11 attacks. The new RNC ad in Georgia warns of a filibuster-proof Democratic majority. That may not happen. In Alaska, the Division of Elections was supposed to count most of the 90,000 early and absentee ballots today. The convicted felon, Senator Stevens, had led the Democrat, Mark Begich, by about 3,200 votes before today's canvassing. The final tally not expected before tomorrow, but the Anchorage Daily News and other news organizations reporting about 43,000 of those votes have been counted. The lead right now, Mark Begich, the Democrat, 125,019 votes. Senator Stevens, Republican incumbent, 125,016 votes. Let's bring in the national political reporter for WashingtonPost.com, Chris Cillizza. Chris, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
I'm sure that Alaska race is much tighter than the vote would indicate. What on earth is happening there?
You know, Keith, it's a fascinating thing because, as you point out, there were 90,000 votes that essentially had not been counted from last Tuesday until today. It's a mixture of people who voted early, which is apparently an oxymoron. You vote early, but it gets counted late. Question ballots, people, their name didn't show up exactly right, and then absentee ballots. So they're supposed to count about 52,000 today, with the rest coming later this week or next week. And as you point out, this is absolutely amazing. You've seen Mark Begich essentially gain 3,200 votes in one day. Always a warning. You never know exactly where those votes are coming from. If they're from the Anchorage area, that's good for him. He was the mayor of Anchorage. That's going to be his base. You never know if there are other votes out there from more Republican areas. But it's certainly a lot closer than I think we thought it might be.
All right, so we've probably got as many more votes to be counted as have been added today, somewhere between 43,000,
right.
47,000, something like that. Any indication of where this is headed? Is there a Lord help us, is there a chance of a recount that could send a senator back to Washington where he will be expelled, forcing another election? Where are we going?
You know, Keith, I wish I knew. I would have probably told you before this count started today that Mark Begich would narrow the margin but would not be able to overcome Senator Stevens. We usually see this in things where there's a number of ballots not counted. Typically, one candidate wins 53%, one candidate wins 47%. It's not enough to overturn it. So I wouldn't make any predictions. I will tell tell you, though, I'd be interested to know who the Republican Party leadership is rooting for, because I don't think they want Ted Stevens to come back. Jim DeMint has already said he would vote to expel Senator Stevens. I think they want a clean break with the last 8 years. They don't want this taint of corruption, and they would almost rather, I don't say they would rather, but I think it is a debate whether they want Senator Stevens back or not.
All right, let's switch briefly over here to Minnesota. The recount is mandated, as we all know, by law in Minnesota. What are the Republicans hoping to accomplish by trashing the recount? I mean, are they setting up a court battle if Franken wins?
Well, I think what we're seeing is an attempt to sway public opinion, but ultimately, Keith, you're right. It's very likely, given the fact that I think it was 203 votes the last time I sort of clicked refresh on my Associated Press vote count in Minnesota, it's very likely this thing is headed to a manual recount. And manual means manual, by hand. Several million votes could not be decided until December. So I think what's going on both the Coleman and the Franken side is an attempt to cast this before. It's sort of working the referees. Before this canvassing board, which was named this evening, meets, they want to try and get public opinion on their side. It may not matter ultimately. What matters is whether there's more votes for Franken or more votes for Coleman. But this is all part of the politics of it.
And Georgia, is Senator McCain feeling indebted because Senator Chambliss had endorsed him for president in February? Or what is the point here? If there's some sort of attempt at rehabilitation from this tough presidential campaign, why is McCain going there with that man?
I'm not convinced that he feels as though he owes Saxby Chambliss. Saxby was not one of the people who was on, or very early on, Lindsey Graham, John Thune, those kind of people. My guess, Keith, is that McCain views himself, and is viewed because he's the Republican nominee for president, as a party leader. This December 2nd runoff, this is not like the general election. This may well be a battle of the bases. Who can turn their voters out on a very, very unorthodox election day? And so I think the goal is to put people like Mitt Romney, Rudy Giuliani, Sarah Palin, John McCain down into Georgia on the Democratic side, on the Republican side, in hopes of really energizing that base and turning them out.
All right. Well, now, obviously, the Alaska thing is in doubt. Minnesota is going to a recount. We don't know we've already got a second vote in Georgia. If all three of those seats went to the Democrats, they would have a 59, including Bernie Sanders, and then 60, including bingo, Joe Lieberman. I mean, is he the guy rooting for, or should we see if he voted in Alaska and Georgia and Minnesota? Where is he? Where is he now, and how valuable is he with every passing day?
Well, Keith, the scenario you just outlined, I think if you wrote it as a novel, people would reject it because it was too outlandish. But I think Joe Lieberman got a big vote of confidence earlier this week when Barack Obama said he would like him to remain in the Democratic caucus. I think most senators are going to defer, whether they want to or not, are going to defer to the president-elect. My guess is Joe Lieberman remains in the Democratic caucus. The thing to watch, does he retain that Homeland Security chairmanship? If he doesn't, does he bolt on his own right?
All right, the national political reporter for WashingtonPost.com, writer of The Fix, Chris Cillizza. Great thanks for your time.
Thank you, Keith.